Okay, wonderful. I'm Seth Godfrey, Manager of Adult Services. It's a proud moment to be joined once again with folks from Yale Science and News. It's a great partnership, and it's been going on for several years, and we are going via Zoom. And just before we start, I just want to tell everybody we're doing curbside, so we have How to Build a Habitable Planet. So if you want to check it out, think about it. Lots of books here. And I will turn it over to Olivia, and she'll do introductions. And thanks again, everybody.
Great, thank you so much. So as you've heard, we are Science in the News with Yale Science Communication. We're an organization of grad students at Yale committed to engaging in informative science outreach. I'm Olivia, and I'm really excited to be introducing our talk today on how to build an Earth, just add water. So you'll be hearing from 3 speakers about the origin of life on Earth and what makes it unique. They'll each have 15 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So here are our 3 speakers today. First, we have Garrett, who researches planetary system formation in the astronomy department. And Garrett is a huge baseball fan and has been to 23 out of the 30 major league stadiums. Next, we have Victor, who studies neurodegenerative genetic diseases and is from the garlic capital of the world. And finally, we have Dan, who studies the behavior of water molecules in the molecular biophysics and biochemistry department. And like many of us this year, he's been getting into baking and has a sourdough starter named Evangeline. Before I hand things over to our first speaker, I want to give you a brief overview of our topic today. So the goal of today's presentation is to give you a deep dive into how our planet became the Earth, this blue marble you can see here, which is capable of sustaining life. We sometimes take the existence of the Earth for granted, but the fact that the Earth was capable of creating life and sustaining it is so incredibly unlikely that we haven't found any planet like it. So first, Garrett is going to bring us back to the actual formation of the Earth and the solar system and show us where the first water on Earth came from. And then Victor will take us to the primordial Earth to tell us about the importance of water for creating the very first building blocks that would eventually become life. And finally, Dan is going to tell us about the unique properties of the molecules that make up life on Earth today, and tell us about some still unsolved mysteries of these asymmetrical molecules. So with that, I will hand things over to Garrett and let you share your presentation.
Cool. Thank you for the really nice introduction, Olivia. Can everybody see my screen now? And can they see it in full screen now? Okay, awesome. So awesome. As Olivia said, my name is Garrett Levine, and I'm a PhD student here studying astronomy at Yale. Specifically, I study what's called planetary astrophysics. So I study planetary system formation and evolution, how the planets essentially are born and how they change over time. So today I'm going to be talking about how specifically the Earth formed and how we believe that Earth got its water. So to motivate our talk, we should talk a little bit about why we're interested in water specifically. And Olivia has already shown you the image on the right where we have the dark kind of gray dead moon in the front, and we have this bright blue marble, the living dynamic Earth in the background. And what I want to call your attention to is that really the big difference between these two bodies is that the Earth has water and the moon does not. All life on Earth as we know it requires water, and pretty much everywhere on Earth where we find water, we find life. Now, to give you a sense of just how much water we're talking about, I've shown the image on the left side of the slide where we have the Earth as if it were dried out and all of the water on the Earth were balled up in a sphere. So as we can see, it's really not that much water, but it's very important for life. Now, there's only 2 ways that the Earth could have gotten its water. First, the Earth could have been born with its water. Whatever stuff the Earth formed from could have had that sphere of water in it, and that's how we ended up with our water. Alternatively, if this wasn't the case, the Earth has to have acquired its water later. So let's dive into the science and figure out which one it is. to get a sense of how the Earth formed, we actually need to understand Earth's place in the solar system. So I've shown this cartoon diagram that you might be familiar with of the solar system, but I also want to show you what the solar system looks like if you took a spaceship and looked down at it from a bird's eye view. As you can see, it's mostly just empty space. All 4 of the terrestrial planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars, are contained within this little ring here denoting Mars's orbit, and the sun is actually the only thing you can see. The planets are too small to see from this far away. Now, as scientists, we can make some observations about the universe and about the solar system, and the first thing I want to point out is that similar planets are grouped together. So, as I mentioned, we have the rocky planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars. Moving a little further out, we have the gas giants, Jupiter and Saturn. And moving even further out, we have the ice giants, Uranus and Neptune. Now, the solar system is also flat as a pancake. All of the mass, all of the objects are essentially contained in a pancake-like shape. Not really a hockey puck, not a ball, not paper thin, but really pancake flat. And the planets also all orbit in the same direction. So this grouping of planets, this flatness of the solar system, and the orbits in the same direction all indicate that the solar system probably had a common origin. It probably all formed at the same time from the same stuff. So now I want to move on and tell you a story that physicists came up with around the year 1800 of how this might have happened. So first, let's imagine that there's a cloud of gas and dust in space, and there's so much mass in this cloud, there's so much stuff, that the force of gravity actually causes the cloud to shrink and attract itself. So this cloud collapses from a large cloud into a small one. Now, as this cloud shrinks, the gas and dust should actually start to spin faster and faster, and because it spins faster, it should flatten into a disk. Moving on, we have this dust in the disk that sticks together to form pebbles, which then stick together to form boulders, and those boulders stick together to form planets. And we think that this takes place over the timescales of a few million years. So this is great. This is a really cool story, but I want to give you a little bit of intuition for how this might happen and how someone would have even come up with this hypothesis. So to do that, let's think about the physics of spinning clouds. And I want to make some analogies to things you might be familiar with in everyday life. So a cloud of gravitating gas, this shrinking cloud, will spin. And we can think of this in the context of an ice skater. So notice that when she jumps and spins fast, she pulls her arms towards her body. And that allows her to spin faster than if her arms were out to the side. So the same physics applies to these clouds. As they shrink, the stuff gets pulled in and they start to spin faster than they would have otherwise. Now, these clouds should also flatten, and we can think of this like the fair ride to the right side of the screen. So when this starts, the chairs are all hanging straight down, but when the ride spins, they start to flatten into a disc-like shape, and we can imagine if this ride got completely out of control, all of the chairs would actually flatten even with the bars that are holding them up. So they would flatten into a disk. Now, the key point here is that gravitating gas, this shrinking cloud of gas and dust, should form what we call a protoplanetary disk. Proto meaning before and planetary meaning planets. So the before planets disk. Now, with 200 years more of computing power and advances in math and science, we're actually able to simulate these clumps, these clouds of gas and dust. So on the left side of the screen, you see the beginning stages of a simulation on a computer of this cloud of gas and dust starting to shrink. Now this is 80,000-ish Earth-Sun distances across, so this is much larger than the solar system. But if we fast forward 250,000 years and zoom in 15 times, we see something more on the scale of the solar system, about 5,000 Earth-Sun distances across. And in the bottom right of the screen here, we see a disk starting to form, just like we predicted from our knowledge of ice skaters and fair rides. Now, what's really remarkable about these simulations is that the computer doesn't know about the ice skaters and it doesn't know about the fair rides. The only thing it knows about is the gas and dust and gravity, the same force that holds us to the ground on the Earth. And what's remarkable is if we let the computer do its thing and do the math, we end up finding the same thing that we predicted from our knowledge of ice skaters and other phenomena in everyday life. And to me, that's really, really remarkable. Now, we would really like to find these clouds in space. It's a little bit too late to find the cloud that formed the solar system, but what we can do is we can look in the sky and figure out where this is taking place elsewhere in the galaxy. So if we look at the Milky Way, we see the bright background stars, but in front of them, we see these dark patches that are obscuring or stopping the starlight from reaching us. Now, the same astronomers who came up with the nebular hypothesis, this hypothesis of planet formation, figured out that these clouds are actually where planet formation is happening today. And this kind of corresponds to the first panel of that simulation. Now, with better telescopes, we can actually zoom in on a really tiny patch of this, and we can see the clouds that correspond to the second part of that simulation. Now, there's so much gas and dust here that it blocks the starlight behind it, and we can't even see what's going on inside, but better and better telescopes over the last 5 years have allowed us to peer inside these clouds and see what's actually going on. So, as I said, this is only about 5 years old. We've had 200 years of theory, finding the clouds, computer simulations, and it's all come to this remarkable picture. This is a protoplanetary disk, the before planets disk, on the size of the solar system, and we see the bright emission, the light coming from the dust in this disk. And what's even more remarkable is that we see gaps in the disk. Those gaps in the disk correspond to where the dust isn't. And what we can do is we can hypothesize that that might be where the planets are forming. That might be where the dust is sticking together and forming pebbles and forming boulders and forming planets. And with even better telescopes, we can peer into the disks. And I've highlighted this little white splotch that we've observed for a few years now, and it's moving. Now, this is undeniably a planet, and this is the slam dunk. This is how planets form. They form in disks. This is a huge victory for theoretical physics. 200 years of theory, computer simulations, thinking about just how ice skating works has led us to this picture. Now, we need to get back to water. We've kind of taken a detour and we've talked a little bit about how planets form, but now let's think about what the disk itself looks like. So we've been taking a bird's eye view so far, which is kind of like looking at the pancake from the top. Now I want to take an edge-on view, or looking at the pancake from the side, so we can figure out where the Earth is. What I've done here is plotted that disk. I've drawn a picture of the disk with the planets in their positions where they are today. Now, if I'm closer to the sun, it's warmer, and if I'm further from the sun, it's colder. At some point in this disk, there's what's called the ice line. So if I'm closer to the sun than the ice line, water exists as a vapor. It exists as a gas. And if I'm further away from the sun, it's cold enough that water can be a solid. It can be an ice. It can get incorporated into the planets that are forming. Now, you might ask where the liquid water is, but liquid water can't exist in the vacuum of space. What needs to happen is you need to have a planet with an atmosphere for water to be liquid. In space, water acts like dry ice. It goes straight from gas to ice and ice to gas. Now, we can figure out where the Earth is in this disk by looking at the objects around us. So in the inner solar system, we have Mercury, which is really hot and has no water. But if I move a little further out near Saturn, I find Enceladus, which is one of its moons, and it's completely covered by ice. So the ice line is somewhere between Mercury and Saturn, and what we can actually figure out is that ice line should be further away than Earth is from the sun. So the key point is that water actually could not have been frozen in the material making the water, or making the Earth, so the water had to come from somewhere else. To figure out where the water came from, we actually need to look a little bit at chemistry and geology, and we need to look at the water molecule itself. Water is 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, H2O. But what you might not know is that hydrogen actually comes in 2 forms. It comes in regular hydrogen and it comes in heavy hydrogen, And sometimes one of those heavy hydrogens ends up in a water molecule. Now, if I can compare the amount of heavy hydrogen that the Earth has to the heavy hydrogen of other objects in the solar system, it's almost a chemical fingerprint. I can figure out where the Earth's water came from by figuring out how much heavy hydrogen the Earth has and other objects have. It's like it's a chemical fingerprint. It lets me figure out where the Earth's water came from. Now, what I'm going to do is show you how much heavy hydrogen is in the bodies of the solar system. So we have this same cartoon figure of the planets, and the higher up they are on the slide, that means there's more heavy hydrogen in the planets. So the sun and the giant planets actually have about the same heavy hydrogen content. And that makes sense. They formed from the same gas and dust cloud and the same gas and dust disk. Moving further out, the sun actually has about the same heavy hydrogen content as our neighboring stars. So that's good. That means that they formed kind of in the same environment. Now, comets have too much heavy hydrogen compared to Earth, but Earth has almost exactly the same proportion of heavy hydrogen as asteroids. So here's the story, and here's what this is telling us. It's telling us that the Earth formed dry. It formed without water, but later when the Earth had an atmosphere, collisions with asteroids would have brought water to Earth where it could exist as a liquid. And we know this because we match the heavy hydrogen from Earth to the heavy hydrogen of asteroids. So the key point here is that bombardment by asteroids after most of the Earth formed probably delivered water. So the Earth formed, asteroids hit it and brought water with it, which was then able to stay on the Earth as a liquid. So let me recap what we've talked about so far today. I've talked about the nebular hypothesis, this hypothesis of how planets formed, where there's a cloud of gas and dust in space. There's so much stuff that it collapses into a disk under its own gravity. And from there, pebbles form, which form boulders, which form planets. Moving on, we looked inside the disk and we figured out how hot it would be where the Earth formed. And we know that the Earth formed too hot to retain its water. There's no way that ice could have been frozen out in the rocks that made the Earth. And finally, what we did is we looked at the heavy and light hydrogen, the heavy and the regular hydrogen, to figure out that Earth's water probably came from asteroids after the Earth formed and after we had an atmosphere to keep that water. So let's get back to our checklist of building an Earth. So far, we have a planet, a generic planet, but one with liquid water. Next, Victor's going to talk about the building blocks of life. How did that water become so important and why did that lead to there being life? And finally, Dan is going to talk about the uniqueness of life as we know it. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'll turn it over to Victor now.
Awesome. Are you guys able to see my screen? Perfect. All right, let's do this. Thank you for that introduction. My name is Victor Oimos. I'm a second year here at Yale, not Stanford. I got the beanie to prove it. The thing's too expensive for me to fake this. I actually go here. Thank you for my family for coming. Thank you guys, and shout out to you. And I'm gonna get started. Awesome. My talk today is gonna be about the building blocks of life. And I really wanted to give a recap on what we just heard, right? Earth was formed when asteroids brought water. And to visualize this, I made a little simple timeline of the history of Earth. Earth was formed about 4.5 billion years ago. And somewhere in between 4.5 to 4 billion years is when asteroids are bringing water to Earth. Now, to make this timeline, pretty perspective, I put dinosaurs on here. 230 million years ago, and you can see how close it is to us 2.4 million years ago. So this happened a long time ago when water was brought to Earth. Now, in my talk, I'm going to talk about where did life come from? Where did the first life on Earth arise? So to put on the timeline, the first life we think happened around 4 billion years ago. And you could see that happens right after or even during asteroids bringing water to Earth. And you can see that before water, there was no life. So what is life? Life is made of 4 macromolecules called lipids, carbohydrates, protein, and nucleic acids. Lipids are things like fats and oils, and you need these to survive. People think fats and oil are usually bad. They don't want to eat fat. Well, you need it to survive. One key important thing is every cell in your body, the membrane is made out of lipids. You didn't have lipids, your cells would not survive. Another fun fact about lipids that's actually very important in the news right now is the COVID vaccine. The RNA in this vaccine is packaged in a lipid nanodroplet. So lipids in this little droplet can go into your cell and go into the cell very easily. So good thing for lipids that we now have this possible vaccine. The other macromolecule is carbs or carbohydrates. And these are really sugars. And you get these from most things you eat, breads, fruit, or my favorite, the humble potato, because they can become anything, especially French fries. Now there are two more I want to talk about in depth for the rest of my talk. Now these are proteins and nucleic acids. And to help you understand what these are, I got to tell you about the central dogma very briefly. And the central dogma is not this. It's not a cute dog, sadly. What the central dogma is the process in which DNA goes to RNA to protein. And I'm going to explain what these three molecules are. So DNA is essentially the blueprints of the body. It has all the instructions to make you you, and everyone's DNA is unique and different. And our DNA eventually becomes RNA, and you can think of RNA simply as a delivery mechanism in the body. It reads the DNA and delivers it to a little factory in the cell to then make proteins. And what is a protein? Well, a lot of people think protein in the nutritional sense, meat, chicken, all that stuff that you eat. You eat the protein to survive. But, you know, there's also the, oh, wow, I need to work on my Photoshop skills. But if I work on that, I could look good. Wow. No, proteins also, right? They make strong muscles in your body. And that's still that nutritional sense. So I want to get to what are proteins and how do they build the body and the cells? And to answer that, to think about that, we're going to think that proteins are like Legos. So when you build a little Lego structure, you can see in this image, each structure is unique. They have small blocks or big blocks, 3 or 4 or 2 different numbers of blocks, and they make a different structure, and you can think of it as a different protein. But if you break these proteins apart, what are they made of? They're made of smaller individual Legos. And so you can think that proteins are made of a smaller component, and those components are called amino acids. And this is a cute little joke to help you remember amino acids, saying, what do you call an acid in attitude? It's a little mean little acid saying, give me your lunch. And you would call this amino acid. So I hope this little joke helps you remember that for the rest of this talk. So what are these amino acids? Well, there are 20 of them, 20 essential amino acids you need to survive. And I picked out one of them, glutamine, because of importance to me in my research and I do here. This amino acid is drawn here, and I drew each element of this amino acid in different color to highlight that it's made of really 4 simple components: carbon with a C, nitrogen with an N, hydrogen with an H, and oxygen with an O. So very simply, 4 elements, but it depends what order you have them and how many you have that make each amino acid. And we only have 20 amino acids. We have thousands of proteins in the body that are all unique and do different things. If you think about that, each little Lego structure is unique and identical. But again, 20 amino acids, how can you make so many? Well, I want to refer you to something, the English alphabet. We have 26 letters in our alphabet, yet we can make hundreds and thousands of words, unique words. And most words are, I would say, less than 15 letters for sure. Proteins can be hundreds or thousands of amino acids long. So you can imagine with 20 amino acids going for 1,000 long, you can make a lot of unique proteins, which is really amazing. But really, where did they come from is the essence of this talk. Where did they come from? How did life arise on Earth? Well, if we go back to this timeline and we see that single cell organisms arose about 4 billion years ago, that's when the first ones were made. Well, we're going to look and we're going to go back in time to that era of Earth before life, this primordial Earth. And this is a great artistic rendition of life, primordial life on Earth. And there are 2 things that stick out to me in this drawing. One is the water. So much water. But 2 are the volcanoes, spewing gases into the atmosphere and also being a source of heat. Now that heat can come important later on. But let's focus on these gases. Earth's early atmosphere was hypothesized to be made of simple gases such as methane, hydrogen, or ammonia. And you'll notice here that there's something missing. There's no oxygen in these simple gases I drew. And if you look back at this molecule, glutamine, there's quite a few oxygens in it. So where did that come from? How did we make life without oxygen? How is this possible? Well, back in 1952, two scientists named Miller and Urey looked at primordial Earth, and they wanted to see if we could make life. So they used resources that were in abundance back then, such as these simple gases, methane, hydrogen, ammonia. However, they also added one more key ingredient, and that's water. And that has oxygen that could be used in this reaction. But you can't just put methane, hydrogen, and ammonia together and shake it in a bottle and boom, you get life. You need something like, you need an energy source. And what they used was lightning. And so this is a little diagram of their experiment in which they put the molecules into this little glass chamber, and they sparked electricity, kind of like spark plug in your car, and zapped it. And it went through the experiment, and it boiled together with water, and went through a couple times. And this little heat source underneath the water, you could think that primordial Earth had volcanoes that are above and below water, providing that source of heat to also keep this process going, not just the lightning, also maybe the volcanoes. And so they did this experiment, basically lightning in a bottle, and they found out that they made at least 5 amino acids. Remember, these are the little Legos, not the proteins yet, just the little Legos. Some of those were glycine, which is pretty simple looking. Another one is alpha alanine, and interestingly, they also made beta alanine. And now what is this alpha beta? Well, these molecules are mirror images of one another. And that's actually what Dan's gonna talk about next. And how that, what they look like in 3-dimensional space is really important for life. And so it's really cool that this first experiment made both of these molecules. But you may recall that we need 20 amino acids for life. So they made 5, but we need 20. So how, is this right? Well, in the past decade or so, later studies have looked back at these experiments and tried to reproduce them using different gases and what we think the Earth looked like now. And these experiments produced actually 17 amino acids out of the 20, which is pretty awesome. But not only that, it also made DNA and the molecules that make up DNA. And if you recall, DNA molecules are the blueprint for life. They're the instructions. They're that little instruction manual that comes with your Lego set. Now, without that little instruction manual, you might not be able to make the little Lego set you're trying to make. So it's really amazing that the simple experiments could both make the Legos and the instruction manual that go with it. So to simply wrap up my talk, we could look at that Earth in the corner. We had water formation on Earth, and now we learned about that primordial Earth, that spark that caused life. And we learned that proteins, which are the building blocks of life, are actually composed of amino acids. And we really learned that without water, these amino acids wouldn't have really been made. And water really was the most important driving force for biological life to happen on Earth. And next up, I'm gonna pass it off to Dan, and he's gonna talk about how structure codes for life, how this alpha and beta alanine are similar, yet very, very different. Thank you for listening to my talk.
Hey, thanks, Victor. Just a second. All right. Hi, so can everyone see this? All right. So hi, I'm Dan, and I'm going to talk about molecular handedness and the origin of life. Now, I'll explain what all that means later. So quick recap. So Garrett told us about how water got to Earth from asteroids, most likely. Victor told us how the early Earth itself, in its molecular context, could have given rise to the precursors of biological molecules. Now there's only one more step. That's actually taking those simple molecules and turning them into life. So can we do that? Well, let's step back for a second and talk about something that seems completely different. Most molecules and most objects actually have some sort of symmetry. For example, a water molecule has what's called reflection symmetry, which means, for example, that you can take the right half of the molecule and reflect it, and it will look exactly like the left half. Also, water molecule happens to have rotational symmetry, which means actually twofold rotational symmetry, which means that you can rotate the water molecule on this axis 180 degrees, and it will look the same as it did originally. So these are, pretty simple symmetry properties that you're familiar with from regular objects, tables, chairs, even the human body. But let's look at something else. Take a look at your hands. Put them in front of you. And I want to ask you the question, are your two hands the same or are they different? I'm going to give you a second to think about that. So the answer is both. They're the same, or approximately the same, in that they're actually mirror images of each other. But they're not the same because there's no way that you can take your right hand and twist it around to become your left hand, because the palm would end up facing the wrong way. So these are what's called non-superimposable mirror images. And this is going to be very, very important going forward in the talk. Let's take a look at this molecule. It doesn't matter what the atoms are here. Just remember that it's a sphere bound to 4 spheres of different colors. Take a look at this molecule. Now take a look at this molecule. Are these molecules the same or are they different? Well, what we can do to test that is take the molecule on the right and rotate it to try to look like the molecule on the left. But when we do that, we find something interesting. We find that the purple and red spheres align, but now the green and the white don't align with each other. So these are actually mirror images that are not superimposable, just like hands. And more generally, this type of molecule has no symmetry whatsoever. This phenomenon is called molecular chirality, from the Greek word hieri, which means hand. And it makes sense why the word hand was used. Now, a little bit of history. So Louis Pasteur, you might be familiar with him because he also discovered germ theory. But he interestingly discovered the phenomenon of molecular chirality by looking at the solid masses in the bottom of barrels of wine, like the lees of wine. And he found that in those lees, there were 2 kinds of crystals, one that looked like the one on the left and one that looked like the one on the right. Now take a look at these crystals very carefully. If you look at them carefully, you will see that they're exactly like I just talked about. They are non-superimposable mirror images. There's nothing you can do to take the right one and turn it into the left one without something facing the wrong way. And now with actually more advanced science, we know that the molecules in question look like this. They're 2 mirror images. And the molecules are actually called tartaric acid, and it's a common acid found in many fruits, like grapes. Okay, this is very interesting, and I love chemistry, but you might not love chemistry. So why should you care about this? Well, okay, let's go back to the 50s. So in the 50s, there was a drug called thalidomide that was prescribed for morning sickness during pregnancy. And everything was fine until suddenly a lot of babies started to be born with missing hands, fingers, toes, and other body parts. And nobody knew why. Well, they dug deeper and they found out that while that thalidomide is actually a handed molecule, it has 2 mirror image forms that are not exactly the same. And the one on the left helps pregnant women with morning sickness. The one on the right causes birth defects like missing arms, legs, and fingers. And okay, the reason why people were actually exposed to the one on the right is because most types of chemical synthesis, when they produce this molecule, produce a 50-50 mixture of both of them. And this 50-50 mixture is what people take. And so half of it helps them and half of it hurts the baby. So, okay, you might be wondering, okay, this is interesting, but why is molecular handedness able to affect human health so much? There must be some reason on the side of the human body. Well, there is a reason. If you look at these molecules that I have displayed here, on the top you have a schematic of DNA, and on the bottom you have a schematic of a protein. It's a type of protein actually found in muscles. And fun fact, this is the protein that makes muscles red, or red meat red. So if you actually look, you see that you can have two different forms of the molecule, the left-hand one and the right-hand one. But if you actually look into the cells of the body of humans, any kind of animal, any kind of plant, any kind of fungus, any kind of bacterium, any kind of life at all, you will see that only the right-handed version of DNA is actually present. And if you look at the proteins, you will see that only the left-handed form of protein is present. So just with this information, we can understand why the body may react differently to molecules with different handedness. For example, take this glove that I have here. If I try to put my right hand on this right glove, it slides in and everything fits and everything works perfectly. But what if I try to put this glove on my left hand? Now I might be able to force it through, but if I push hard enough, I might actually damage the glove because it doesn't fit correctly. You can't do this with rubber gloves, so you'd have to do this with actual gloves. But you can see how it might actually break the glove. And by this analogy, you can see how drugs that have different handednesses might be able to affect a body that has handedness differently. And the sort of takeaway from this is that the molecules of life are also handed or chiral. Okay, now we're starting to sound like a 2-year-old who keeps asking why? Well, let's keep asking why, because that's the purpose of science. So why does this happen? How did this kind of one-handedness come about, that DNA is right-handed and proteins are left-handed? Why? So let's examine some ideas that people have had about why this actually occurs. So first, I'm going to go back to the Miller-Urey experiment. So Victor told you about this experiment where they took simple molecules present on the early Earth, and they added a source of energy also present in abundance on the early Earth, lightning, and they made many simple molecules like the parts of DNA and amino acids. But Victor alluded to the fact that for some of these amino acids, they made both one version and the other version. And the two versions that he was talking about was the left-handed version and the right-handed version. It turns out in the Miller-Urey experiment, while it's a very, very impressive experiment, they actually made 50-50 mixtures of all of these different molecules. Whereas in life, you see only one-handedness and not the other. So this is actually a crucial sort of weakness or failing of these kinds of experiments. So, okay, let's say we assume that one-handedness was slightly dominant at some point, right? By chance, maybe the right-handed kind of DNA was slightly more abundant than the left. Is there any way that that slight chance abundance might turn into a full dominance of the right-handed version of DNA, and the same for proteins? So we can ask, was it a chemical process? Was it something involving chemical reactions? And by the way, DNA replication, as it happens, is also a chemical reaction. Or it might have been a physical process having to do purely with physical changes, such as crystallization, as I'll talk about. So let's explore both. So here, I'm going to talk about DNA replication. So the way DNA replicates is the two strands of DNA in a double helix split, and then each strand acts as a template for a new complementary strand to bind to it. And that's how you get one DNA to turn into two DNAs. And you can think of this like a handshake. Now, if you are shaking someone's hand and it's your right hand and their right hand, the handshake works perfectly. Or if it's your left hand and their left hand. But if you try to shake a right hand and a left hand, it's very awkward. Like you can try it just with yourself. And the same thing happens with DNA. If you have DNA that's right-handed, when it replicates and templates further DNA, those new DNA molecules will also be right-handed. So basically both left-handed and right-handed DNA have the ability to multiply themselves. And you can think of this as a series of handshakes. And you can think that if at some point there was a slight excess of the right-handed form, or for some reason the right-handed form was able to replicate a little bit faster than the left-handed form of DNA, because of the way that exponential growth works, because you go from 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16, 16 to 32, etc. Every time you replicate, that kind of exponential growth is extremely sensitive to the rate of replication. And if the rate of replication is slightly faster for the right-handed version than the left-handed version, then over a relatively short amount of time, the right-handed version can become fully dominant or so completely, dominant that the left-handed version is basically nothing but a trace and eventually essentially negligible. So that's something that could have happened. So we've established that it could have been a chemical process that, by chance, the right-handed form of DNA was better at replicating because of some small change in the environment. So let's discuss also if it might have been a physical process. So the physical process of note here is crystallization. This is the process when molecules that are in solution, that are in liquid, crash out of solution and form crystals. So if you typically form crystals of some complicated molecule like DNA, at first you'll see small, dirty crystals made up of lots of different types of DNA, sort of bunched together. And this could include right-handed DNA mixed with left-handed DNA in very awkward and small crystals. But if you take those crystals and you heat things up a little bit and you redissolve them in the water, and then you slowly cool the system down or slowly evaporate the water, you can get much nicer crystals to form. And specifically, you can get right-handed DNA to associate with its preferred partner, which is other right-handed DNA, and the same thing for left-handed DNA. And when that happens, you form big, pure crystals of right-handed DNA and left-handed DNA. Now, imagine that one such crystal formed in a pool somewhere on the early Earth, and a wind came along and blew one of them out into another pool where, for example, the building blocks of proteins had been made by a process similar to that discovered by Miller and Urey. You can imagine that because of that chance encounter, because it was right-handed DNA that achieved that, right-handed DNA became the origin of life. But that also implies something very interesting, which is that life appeared only once, which we don't know if that's actually true, but this would suggest that it did, because this would suggest that one chance event blew one-handedness of DNA into some productive pool that produced life, and the other one was blown away or buried or something happened to it that it disappeared. So now we've established that it could have been a chemical process and it could also have been a physical process. Okay, so where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us in a very interesting spot. So again, to sort of review, our DNA is right-handed and only right-handed, and our proteins are left-handed and only left-handed. And we don't really know why yet at this point. And just to recap in general, Garrett told us about how water came to the early Earth, crucial for all of the chemical reactions forming life. And then early Earth formed biological molecules in Victor's talk. But now I've tried to connect all the dots and say, how did that actually form life? And we've come up with a big question mark. Lots of speculation, but a big question mark. But this is not necessarily a bad thing. In general, in science, mysteries are very, very useful. In fact, they're more useful than any sort of certainty, because very often the most difficult intellectual task in science is not to get the answer, but to come up with an appropriate question. Because if you have a good question, then in the process of discovering the answers to that question, you will discover many, many other things that are very interesting that you never would have looked for otherwise. And the question of why life on Earth has this handedness property is one of those really amazing questions that's going to help scientists discover many, 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 many interesting things about the origin of life. Even if we never discover why DNA is right-handed and proteins are left-handed, we will discover many, many more things because we asked this very important question. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. So now we have some time for questions. You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask out loud, or put it in the chat if you have anything you want to ask any of our speakers, and they'd be happy to tell you more. Thanks, Caleb.
I have a quick question. Sorry. My name's Ernie. I have a quick question specifically for Victor. So in Victor's talk, he alluded to that in those primordial soup experiments that there was evidence that there was formation of amino acids as well as formation of, preliminary DNA molecules. Was there any evidence of formation of RNA molecules? And my second question is sort of a chicken and the egg type of thing, where essentially if you have the formation of both DNA and amino acids sort of in the same soup, do you have any evidence from those experiments that DNA actually precedes amino acids sort of in the central dogma aspect?
Yeah, so to answer your question, yes, they actually did find the molecules for RNA as well. DNA is made of adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine, and RNA is made of adenine, cytosine, guanine, and uracil. So the uracil replaces thymine, and they actually found uracil in this mixture, in these mixtures they made. So I simplified it down to DNA, but they did find the molecules that could also make RNA. So there was a process for DNA to RNA to protein to be made, even in these simple experiments. The second question of which one predates the other, it's kind of like a chicken and egg. We don't necessarily know. We think that maybe the protein and the RNA molecules that were there might have been able to make their own protein, and that's a very complicated field to study. But we still don't know enough about that. It's gonna take more, Ernie. Thank you.
Super cool, Victor. Nice talk.
There's a question in the chat actually that I wanted to talk about. So the question is about asteroids that brought water to Earth, and the question is, where did those asteroids get water from? So the asteroids that brought water to Earth, remember, they formed further out from the sun than the Earth did. So they actually formed right around the ice line, where water in that protoplanetary disk would have turned from a gas to a solid, to ice. So these asteroids just essentially formed with the water. And then when they came to Earth, when they collided with Earth, they had that water. And at that point, Earth had an atmosphere and was able to retain that water. So that's a really good question, but they formed a little bit further out where it was a little bit colder.
Okay, I got one question for Garrett, actually. You said, I think you said comets couldn't have a higher heavy hydrogen than asteroids. What's the difference between a comet and an asteroid?
So comets, essentially, it's really just where they formed in that disk.
Okay.
So asteroids formed right along the ice line, and they actually don't have as much water because they formed right where water was essentially turning from a solid to a gas. Comets formed much further out. So if asteroids formed around 4 times the distance from the Earth to the sun, comets actually would have formed more like 30 to 100 times the distance from the Earth to the sun. So it was really cold, and they incorporated more water into their composition than asteroids did.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you all so much again. We had a question for Victor. We were wondering, what do you do with glutamine right now? And is glutamine your favorite amino acid? So glutamine is important to me because my family has a genetic disease called Huntington's disease. And it is one of 9 diseases called the polyglutamine diseases. And what this is everybody has certain proteins that have glutamine many times in a row. You got 5 to 36 or so. But once you go above that 36 threshold, you have the disease. So when you have many, many glutamines, it becomes a lethal disease. And so I study diseases like Huntington's. Currently here at Yale, I'm studying a disease called SCA1, spinocerebellar ataxia type 1. And it's very, very similar to Huntington's. So that's why glutamine is important to me. Is it one of my favorites? That's a love-hate relationship, since it got me into science, but also is a disease hurting my family. So that's my answer to your question, I believe.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing.
Can I ask a question on part of the library? This is more inspirational because we have a lot of young people who are probably watching. What inspired you to go into your respective careers, Garrett, Daniel, and Victor, in 100 words and less? No. Anything you can give, any words of future generations? Or
Yeah, I'll just start because I very briefly mentioned that at a young age, I saw my family's disease, and I really wanted to be someone that could do something to change that. So my inspiration was my love for my family, and that's what's driven me all the way to getting my PhD now.
okay.
Garrett, you want to go first, or you want me to go first?
Either way, go for it if you want.
Okay. No, for me, I think it's, I actually was about to go to med school before I went to get my PhD. And I just realized one day that that's not what I want to do. And I'm really happiest when I'm doing scientific research. And specifically when I'm studying something that is at the intersection of physics, chemistry, and biology. And that's exactly what I get to do now in grad school, because I study water structures around proteins and around DNA, which really is at the point where biology, chemistry, and physics come together, and I have to draw from all three of them, and it's really great.
Yeah, I guess for me, I've always thought space and exploration of space was really interesting. This is kind of funny timing because when I was, I guess I was 7 when the Spirit and Opportunity rovers landed on Mars, and I just thought that was the coolest thing. And today, actually, the Perseverance rover successfully landed on Mars. So hopefully that inspires future astronomers and planetary scientists as well.
Thanks.
Thank you all so much again. Before we head out, I also just wanted to give a big round of applause to the speakers again, and also to our coordinator for this talk, Olivia. So every Science of the News talk that Yale Science Communication hosts, there are 3 speakers, and there's a coordinator who works with the speakers to sort of bring out the best in these already exceptional speakers, and hone their presentation skills and everything. And so Olivia's done a terrific job with that, and I would love for us to give her a round of applause as well. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks, Caleb.
Yeah, my pleasure. And then to everyone here and to everyone watching on the NHFPL live stream, I'd love to put in a plug for our social media handles on Facebook. Feel free to follow us. We're currently in the process of trying to bring more consistent content to all our viewers and really create a consistent and engaging and a fun educational online community for science communicators in general at Yale and in the broader Yale and New Haven community. So we would love to have all of you follow us and help us in our journey to bring more content to you.
Caleb, can you just say what's coming up next? I think for viewers, it might be good, your next program, or Olivia.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
The next talk is, actually, I don't have the date for that at the moment, but our next talk is this exact talk coming up again in a few weeks at another library, another virtual event that people are welcome to attend and to register for. And I don't have that information on hand at the moment, but I'd be happy to share that with you to send out to your people. And then we have another series of talks in February with another excellent group of speakers about turning afflictions into treatments and looking at how we can look at things like snake venom and negative side effects of medications and that sort of thing to better understand how diseases work and how to treat disease. And so we're very excited about that talk and the rest of our talks to come in our 2021 season. So stay
That's
tuned.
in March. You said March, you said February.
Yeah, that's
March, okay, great.
Oh, sorry. Yes, that's in March.
I just want to add, it's March 25th at 7 p.m., same time, same place. Zoom on your couch to join in for the good from the bad.
Okay. Again, thanks everybody. On behalf of the library, it's wonderful, the collaboration. We'll see everybody soon.
Thank you so much for having us.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.